Wars with the Moors, Arabs, and so many other people in North Africa had cautioned the Portuguese and the Spaniards to be careful of North Africa. And so when the Portuguese made their way down to West Africa, they were very cautious not to land on fear that they would be spotted and their plans to circumnavigate Africa would be divided and taken over by other people. When they landed at the Canaries, they found a group of people who were both Berber and West African. They would not know because they had no idea what West Africans were. They only had maps that showed people, for example, Mansa Musa. These maps did little to make sure they understood exactly the extent of these people's empires. In fact, they thought that this empire stood inland and had no influences by the coasts. The plans made by the Portuguese at this point was to use Negroes collected from North Africa, Moors and the like, to bring them down to West Africa and have them communicate for them within this empire if they ever got to it. What they found when they first landed was an island. This island, they thought, was a separate island that had nothing to do with any of West Africa. They called it the Island of Idols. This island of idols was unknown to most Muslims and was unknown to most Christians. It was known to some Muslims who lived within the African kingdom of the Songhai. In fact, it was the fringes of the Songhai Empire. No European or Arab or even any other type of Moor or anybody had ever mentioned it. Expecting to land on this island and find people who they consider barbaric, like those they found at the Canary Islands. They found the complete opposite: giant stone walls, people who even had soap, things that they thought were developed only recently. And in fact, their soap was so developed that they later would ban it so that it wouldn't crush the economy of the Spanish or the Portuguese. Now, it must be stressed exactly where this location was. As you can see here, it's near Guinea and Sierra Leone. It's just off of the coast of it, right next to Conakry. Now, because it was connected to the Songhai Empire and the Mali Empire and the Ghana Empire, it had a fruitful history. The people who ran this island were the Baga people. The Baga people were also found in Guinea and Conakry. Those places had already been controlled by them for a long time, and their king was strong beyond that of the others. In fact, when Mali fell, it did not fall. It was the part of Mali that was still holding up. When the Songhai took over, the Songhai were only in control in the sense that they could have influence in that region. It was independent of the Songhai. And during the Kingdom of Ghana, it traded heavily with the Kingdom of Ghana to the point when the Europeans first got there. What was their way of payment? It was the same as any other place in West Africa. They used metals, normal metals, not gold, not none of that, metals. What was to be found in this island? Gold. So therefore, the Portuguese thought, if we can just take over this island, we can have a starter base for gold. Well, that wasn't going to be as easy as it was thought. In fact, it got so rough that the Portuguese told the people not to land on that island, but to seek further distances and land at Sierra Leone. While some maps limit the power of the Songhai to the coastal regions, it's quite clear that it expanded beyond this all the way to the islands. And remember, there were two other kingdoms that were dominating those regions that also had influence from Songhai, but were not necessarily dominated by this very kingdom. They were free, just like this island was, but again, they were companion groups which fought on the behalf of the Songhai. This is the kingdom of Koya. And the kingdom of Koya was so connected to this island that whenever they were challenged, they would be aided by this kingdom. Koya as a kingdom grew larger and larger, not fearing the Songhai's power at the time. And of course, the Songhai's power would be challenged later on. But at this moment, they were a dominant force. And also, something that they did not expect, like I said, this island seems like it's alone. Something the Portuguese did not expect when they tried to set bases in that area is that soldiers just kept coming. In their head, they thought, oh, we're just going to come and fight an army of like 3,000 people. But armies just kept coming, and they just did not understand exactly where this army was coming from. But its heartland was the Songhai Empire. And so, what are you going to do when the Baga people who you met aren't even the ones fighting you? Instead, they are ships of all make and sizes, including Moors coming from the north to protect this one region because they know that it's a strategic trade partner. The only thing they could do, and this was way after they discovered this island. Remember, they didn't land on West Africa until decades after they discovered this island. When they landed on that place, they started a strategic plan. By the way, they were allowed to land on where I'm about to talk about. They were allowed to land there. In other words, this type of West African nation that allowed them to land in that area did not have any ties to the Songhai. In fact, it was an enemy of it in a sense, which allowed them to exist. While they had landed in Mauritania at some point, having very little influence, but having a very tiny post in that region, they realized that strategically they were outmatched, and so they needed another place to find. In comes the modern state of Ghana. Highlighted on Google Earth is Elimna Castle. Now, if you notice, Elimna Castle is so far away from Conakry. All you need to do is travel. So from Ghana, we go to Cote d'Ivoire if we're moving west. From Cote d'Ivoire, we go to Liberia. From Liberia, we go to Sierra Leone. From Sierra Leone, we go to Guinea. Now, remember, there's a reason why Guinea is called Guinea. The word Guinea comes from Ghana. So, Guinea and Guinea-Bissau are part historically of the Kingdom of Ghana. But this Ghana, this new Ghana, only took the name. And it's separated by these two kingdoms. Remember, I told you in Liberia and Sierra Leone, there were two kingdoms that were opposing the Portuguese, even the Dutch later on. Information in Africa was traveling faster on land than it was by sea. And so the Moors had warned all of these kingdoms that the Portuguese were coming. And when the Portuguese came, they found themselves outnumbered. And so they had to sail all the way across to try and form a partnership that far away. Now, of course, they brought guns, they brought all kinds of materials that were previously unknown to these locations, at least this location, because further north in Songhai, many Moors and many Arabs and all of these type of people had already brought guns down to the inside of the Songhai Empire. Now, I could tell you what happens next, but let's read from Cambridge University exactly what happened next. So, in the 1460s, Portuguese explorers had reached the Azores, Cape Verde, Madeira, Sao Tome, and the Canary Islands, where they developed plantation economies based on the use of enslaved Africans. By the way, these Africans are not all black. A lot of them came from basically Arabs in those regions. And those plantations were copying a lot of the technologies that were developed, like sugarcane plants inside that were copied from the Arabs. The Portuguese also settled in the region stretching from the Petite Côte in Senegal and Sierra Leone, including Cape Verde, where they consolidated their presence through trade, which they tried to control. In 1497, now 1497 is after the Portuguese had great influence in the region. From 1440 to about 1470, they were struggling. And again, they found a partner in Ghana, proper Ghana, that would help them set themselves up so they could take control. So in 1497, a Portuguese decree prohibited the trade of iron to Upper Guinea, which had been used as currency in that region before the rise of the Atlantic trade in slavery of Africans. In 1512, another decree ordered enslaved Africans be transported directly from Upper Guinea to Lisbon without stopping in Cape Verde. In 1514, an order prohibited Portuguese subjects to go and live among the Africans in Guinea and stated that no iron should be taken from Cape Verde for trade in Africa. So, what's happening? Why so many decrees? Why so many laws when it came to trade? Well, couple things. First of all, this place was the biggest trade partner with Europe for palm oil, slaves in a sense that were brought from the kingdom of the Songhai kingdom. So they would get people, enslaved warriors, and they'd bring them to the coast, and then the people would buy them from West Africa, right, from that island, and then they would leave. And then they realized that a lot of the trade goods were being limited arbitrarily by the people of that island. And so they realized that they were not really partners of that region. And so they kept making decree after decree to try and strangle the power of this kingdom because they couldn't win it. Not in war. They just had too many partners. Guns didn't make any difference. And of course, to their surprise, guns were found in those regions before the Portuguese got there. But these limitations were only a small amount of the limitations that would come. They would start banning technologies, modern technologies of the time, because they realized that this kingdom was so connected that they had developed modern tech. And this is according to a person who lived at the time. As much as the Portuguese wanted to conquer any place in West Africa, they wanted to conquer this the most. So this is from the island, and remember, it's off of the coast of Sierra Leone. This is written by John Ogley in the 1500s or the 16th century, and this is what he said about this island and Sierra Leone. But above all, an excellent sort of soap made of the oil and ashes of the palm trees, so much exceeding the European soap that it is prohibited to be brought into Portugal, because it should not bring down the price of their own. Here and in neighboring islands grow many sugarcane naturally, whence might be raised great profit from the conveniency of the many adjacent rivers, where mills might be set up to grind them without the charge of slaves. They have also great store of cotton, red-colored wood, vulgarly called brassel, better than that which comes from Brazil, for it will give a texture in dyeing several times. Besides, there is a sort of wood named angelin, fit to build ships with, and the bark affords materials to chalk the seams of the vessels and make match for guns. As you can see here, it becomes quite obvious why they would want to limit trade with this region when clearly they're on the same level as the Portuguese. This sounds strange to the modern mind because, of course, we've been taught that at the time when the Portuguese came, the Portuguese were tenfold above the technology of Africans, but these Africans in this region could read and write. They still had scarification on their face, meaning that they were not Muslim at all, even though they were influenced by Muslim empires. So, for example, the Ghana Empire that existed in this region, we know had some influence of Islam inside of it because people like Al Masudi and so many others who had people travel for them to these regions were documenting their history and said that in places like Aldegost and so many other places within the Ghana Empire, we can go through that again if you want, but in those certain places, Muslims were to be found, and it was introduced at the time at the height of that kingdom. And then, of course, we have the Songhai Wars, where one of the Songhai Empire emperors was accused of being a false Muslim, which tells us that Islam was big in that region. But here, it was non-influential. Now, I must emphasize that we're going back now, right? So these writings are written after the discovery of the Americas and stuff, but we have to still go back to before they discovered America and before they discovered the others. But here, they're still complaining about trade in this region, even after. Like, if you think about it, the place where slavery should have been taken first and foremost was Mauritania. That's where slaves should have been taken in the eyes of the Portuguese. But this became unfeasible or undoable at this time because of all the enemies. So this is the description of the people living in Sierra Leone at the time, and of course still today. The people of Sierra Leone, or the Sierra Lions, and the Cape of Segra or Tagrin are rather brown and black. They mark their bodies in several places with hot irons, and in their faces, ears, and noses, having many holes, wherein they place several jewels, which they call mazubas, and gold rings. They go always naked, only upon their privates they wear a flap made of the bark of trees. Two sorts of Negroes inhabit about Sierra Leone. That is, the Capes, a people of more clear spirit and judgment than those of Guinea, for they easily learn what is taught to them, but with all are effeminate and luxurious, yet of late are much improved in valor and manhood by the continual wars. Notice, by the way that they're writing about them. If they are close to the earth and violent, they call them savage. And then when they are very elegant, they call them feminine, saying that the gold and jewelry represents their femininity. This, of course, is the bias they had for Negroes, which it didn't matter. I mean, I know people today think that the way that you get rid of racism is you become rich, but that's not how it goes away because the people they met were rich. They were laced in gold and jewels and all of that. And these people still made it a problem no matter what the people look like because and which by the way adds to the fact that these people aren't complimenting these people. What you're reading here is not someone bigging up Africans or trying to make them sound better than what they are. He's giving a real account. Africans weren't supposed to even read this. This is for the king of Portugal. Many stories about lands of gold that are about in the Atlantic regions come from kingdoms like this that actually did have the amount of gold. And of course, Mansa Musa's amount of gold that existed prior made it all over the world. including Egypt when he went there and literally plummeted the price of gold because he spread it so much in that region, giving it to just about whoever. Because in his country, it was not a currency because there was just too many of it, too much of it. The thing that was currency was cowrie shells and these irons. But again, they try to strangle the kingdom. But you don't strangle a kingdom by increasing their currency. By limiting the iron and by limiting the copper and many other metals in that region, all they did was strengthen the price of that iron, which is why the ban was lifted. Now, the fact that soaps and many other modern technologies had already been dominated by these people was already a problem. But the second problem was that there are other things that they wanted from Africa that these people already had in spades. For example, as we read here, the other commodities are wax, ivory, and long pepper by the Portugals, called pimenta de cola, and tail pepper or pimenta del rab. Both these sorts are taken to be much better than the East India pepper, but the King of Spain hath prohibited the importing it into his country, that the trade of East India pepper may not be spoiled, which brings them such great profit. However, the English, Hollanders, that's the Dutch, French, and other people that trade in this country bring it over, but the Portugals barter it on the coast of Guinea in exchange for gold, slaves, provisions, and other things, as the places wherein they trade differ or vary. Now, remember one of the quotes that you hear from some of the people that is Africa, when they were trading, they would give away, slaves or gold or whatever for something very tiny. In other words, they would get a bell or something, and their naive mind would be so intrigued by this clickety clacking thing that they would give 50 oxen for a bell, or they would trade 100 slaves for, I don't know, one gun or something. But this is not the case. Clearly, the trade was working in the favor of the Africans. And this, by the way, is in the 16th century, meaning decades after the island was first discovered. These people of Sierra Leone, Guinea, and that island, the island of idols, named after the fact that they still had idols in that area and were not Christian or Muslim, those people were benefiting so much that they had to start prohibiting things from coming into that region.
Extraordinary depictions about how Africans lived like pharaohs before Europeans came and laid waste to their paradise. I wish any of this were true, but it's not. It's fantasy. The truth is that Africans were sold into slavery by other black Africans, and in many cases, sold for items as trivial as gin and mirrors. Whites didn't go into the interior and round up the natives. They waited on the coast for their black partners to bring them black bodies.
For people who are not bought and paid for to say the opposite of the truth, it is quite obvious that in the case of Cambridge, Harvard, and so many other universities, that even during the days when they opposed racial harmony and all of these things, they could not avoid the fact that these kingdoms were above and beyond what other people were saying at the time. This was the true conflict, of course, which was if they can live like that on their own, why don't they do it? Now, the funny part about this island and what she said is that mirrors had already been introduced into this region many years ago. And of course, gin was one of the things that they produced within the kingdom. In fact, they produced all kinds of alcohols that are written about by these people and then traded to North Africa and traded to Europe. Now, as much as I would love to go back and forth on Egypt forever, it is way more important to identify that Egypt is not the only formidable kingdom within Africa. For example, if we continue to read, so we were here, which brings them such great profit. However, the English, Hollanders, French, and other people that trade in this country bring it over, but the Portugals barter it on the coast of Guinea in exchange for gold, slaves, provisions, and other things, according as the pleasure places wherein they trade differ or vary. In Mount Macamela, which we mentioned before, appears from the skirts of whose overshooting edges, which hang like bases or penthouses, several crystalline radi shoot in a pyramidical form, with the points pendant towards the ground, within 4 or 5 foot, like icicles from the eaves of the house, which when struck yield a pleasant twang, like the string of an instrument, both to the delight and administration of the beholders. All the accessibilities that were not granted to the Portuguese and other people at this time would come to a halt when the Portuguese finally found another partner further south than West Africa in the name of the Kingdom of Congo. At first, they did the same thing that they did to West Africa. They kidnapped a few natives of the land and then they sent them to Portugal, taught them Portuguese, and brought them back to the Kingdom of Congo under Diego Chao. The people who were trained would later come back and try to communicate with the Kingdom of Congo and the king specifically, which they first didn't get a word with. They got it with his uncle, who was in charge of the province in that region. This would make it obvious that the Portuguese were now about to dominate certain regions. They found an island just off of the coast of the Kingdom of Congo, which they were granted permission to have until later dates when the Congolese stopped trusting them and then they kicked them out again. But this didn't happen yet. In taking these people back to Portugal, they recognized something that they did not know prior, and that the languages of the people of Africa are not all the same. The people of the Kingdom of Congo, who today we all know are Bantu, spoke a non Niger language. The Niger language was basically completely different. You could not tell that they were related to the languages of Niger, even though they fall under the same group today, Niger Congo languages. You could not tell. Knowing this, they knew that these people must not have the same control or the same suspicions that the people inside of West Africa did. And this is how they basically took control. Now, of course, there's a deeper story in the Kingdom of Congo about how the power was taken by force, and the person who was suspicious, the brother of the prince who would become king, was executed. And so it would be Portuguese influence for a couple of dates. But to go back to West Africa, this lifted a lot of the sanctions because now, why do you care? You have new partners, and suddenly Brazil and other American lands became open for business, and slaves started moving from West Africa to Congo. The majority of slaves that were ever moved to the Americas were slaves from the kingdoms of Congo and Angola. The majority of people that were moved to the Americas were from Congo, not West Africa, where they first ran and invented the black slave trade business. It was first invented in North Africa, but you know what I'm talking about. As we read, African societies had engaged in trans Saharan trade for centuries before the Portuguese arrived in the Atlantic Africa. In Senegambia, the Portuguese established trade and diplomatic ties with polities like the Kingdom of Jolof, while also using extreme violence, including raids, to enslave Africans for transport to Iberia. Therefore, this early Portuguese canon diplomacy complicates applying the concept of agency to African rulers and agents. Expanding southward along the Atlantic coast, the Portuguese settled in Upper Guinea, relying on agreements with local rulers and communities shaped by the organization of these coastal societies. In regions with centralized states, local powers exerted greater control on external trade. In areas where decentralized societies predominated, external agents such as the Portuguese and the later other European powers were in a better position to negotiate and take more control of commercial exchanges with the local rulers, sometimes establishing trading posts along the coasts. In West Central Africa, in the middle of the 16th century, the kingdoms of Ngoyo, Kakongo, and Luanga were the main states of Luanga Coast, their respective ports being Cabinda, Malembo, and Luanga, north of the Congo River. Following early contacts with Portuguese explorers in 1483, these three states started developing external trade activities with the Dutch, English, and French through their seaports, where their commercial agents were based. As the Atlantic slave trade intensified, it is here that the Portuguese first developed the plans of global takeover, using what they learned from these places to try and take over places as far away as Japan, Java, India, and the Swahili coast. European powers established permanent trading posts in the Atlantic Africa to control trade in people and goods. After building a fort in Arguin, 1445, the Portuguese reached the Gold Coast, where they gained permission to construct São Jorge da Mina, or Elimna Castle, completed in 1482. This fortress safeguarded gold and other resources from rival European attacks. The Portuguese were not passive observers in this region. They intervened in regional wars to defend their interests in the gold trade and eliminate European competitors. Additional coastal structures followed in 1555. The Portuguese erected a trading station in Cape Coast, and in 1589 they built a fort in Quechua. In the 17th century, other European powers started the construction of forts and castles in the area that became known as the Gold Coast. In 1652, the Swedish African Company built a fort, Christiansborg, in Osu, today's Accra, later purchased by the Danish. In 1653, the Swedes constructed a fort on Cape Coast, which the English rebuilt in 1663. In the Bight of Benin, Britain, Portugal, and France established forts in Wada. So, of course, we must talk about the Jollof, another powerful empire that was a breakaway from the kingdom of Mali or Mali. This breakaway was an independent state before and then became a dependent state and then became an independent state. Its trade with the Portuguese, was short lived and it was not that deep, which is why they sought to find other places. It only lasted close to 100 years, and then it was abandoned. The distance between this influenced state that was influenced by the Wolof and the influenced state of Sierra Leone and Guinea is relatively small compared to the distances that the Portuguese would go to avoid this location. But again, in these regions, trade was minimal, even though it was one of their great trade partners. The Jollof, who had traded all of these items seen here, we don't need to read them all, you can read them on your own, traded all of these items. But one of the things that they wanted, because of course they were learned people, was paper, which were used for religion, Islam, of course. Although the Jollof state was mainly non Islamic, it was used by these people, and this is documented right here. The European paper is much desired by the marabouts or priests. Now, a marabout is a super religious person who is dedicated to the craft or the religion of Islam. And there are many depictions of these marabouts who deeply looked for paper so that they could document Islam in Arabic, mainly in Arabic, not Ajami, or in an Ajami way, just in pure Arabic, because they thought that they were connected to the original Muhammad, peace be upon him. These same traders from Portugal would be partially responsible for the downfall of the Jollof Empire, which is why the empires in Sierra Leone and lower places did not die until the 1800s when European colonization expanded. Now, the article that I was reading from Cambridge is a very important one because it talks about the ideas of free trade and how Africa at the time had a much larger or much closer concept to free trade than that of the Europeans at the time, which is why it was thriving. And you can see in this reading here that when it came to what did the people of Portugal get in return for all of the things they traded, we can see here it wasn't just slaves. You know, a lot of people like saying that they did everything just for slaves. They would trade this for, it wasn't that. In exchange of these commodities, the merchants received hides, ivory, gold, and other merchandises. The king of Caban gives liberty and freedom to the English, Portugals, French, and Dutch to come in his country and to traffic there. Now, keep in mind, this is opposite to what was happening in that island and Sierra Leone, where the Dutch were altogether banned. The inhabitants themselves in diverse places trade one amongst the other. The people of Cape de Verde, Refrisco, Port de Al, and Ivala come with sloops to this river, Gambia, and buy hides, wax, elephant teeth, rice, gold, cotton, cloths, blacks, that's slaves, and tobacco, which they barter and exchange, some to Europe, some up higher into the country, to their no small profit and gain. And so they just said outright that the people living in this region were basically rich. Anyway, I will discuss the Jollof Empire at a separate time because they completely did a different thing compared to the kingdom that I'm talking about. But yes, the Europeans were afraid of this specific civilization and they had no idea what they were going up against. And even though they successfully kidnapped a small number of people from that island, it is pretty obvious that in a full combat war, they would have lost. If it wasn't for the things that would precede the Europeans discovering the Americas and going to Japan, Of course, after discovering the Kingdom of Congo and discovering South Africa a couple decades later, all of this, all of this would have ended within this one island. Anyway, like, share, subscribe.